This morning, we're about to start a series that's going to look at 1st and 2nd Samuel. So we're going back into the Old Testament, right? We've been in the New Testament all year, and it's been fantastic. But 1st and 2nd Samuel have so many great stories of how of God's interaction with the world and how the world encountered him through many various ways. So we're going to start this morning by looking at the first chapter of 1st Samuel, and it's the story of Hannah. Now, I love my two girls dearly, so what I'm about to tell you, you shouldn't take the wrong way, okay? But according to the University of Canberra, the average cost of raising a child in Australia today from 0 to 21 in today's dollars is $406,000. I know. I was shocked as well. That means that for Shelley and I, we can expect to spend $812,000 by about the year 2020, right, on our two girls. Now, as I said, don't take this the wrong way. If you've got 4 kids here, that's $1.6 million. And it might explain why your bank account is often in red instead of black. If you've got 5 kids, you're probably not here because you can't afford the petrol to get here. Now, you're probably sitting there thinking, I don't know if this sounds quite right. In fact, you've probably seen an ad on TV lately. This is a figure put out by the University of Canberra and AMP. They did this together. I'm not too sure what the motive was, but what I had a quick look into it, and what I did notice is they didn't take into account things like government assistance that many families get in this country, which is a real blessing, right, for us. They didn't take in what they did assume though is probably things like private schooling, and they assumed perhaps overseas holidays and things like that. So you can see how they got to quite a big number. And I'm sure a lot of you sitting there thinking, I've done it a lot cheaper than that. And some of you are thinking, I've done it for a lot more than that. Yeah, so there was a man in the Old Testament, and his name was Elkanah. I hope I get these pronunciations right today. And in biblical times, having a child was somewhat different to us now, I think. I think that the children would often help in the business, right, at quite a young age. If they were on the farm or whatever it is that you did, there was an age where your kids were old enough to help. And so there was like this, I think there was a tipping point where your kids went from perhaps costing you a lot to, they're starting to contribute a little bit more. And over time, perhaps they're even paying their way and stuff starting to come back the other way. So you can see it might have been a little bit different in this culture. And in fact, it probably still happens in some cultures around the world, even to this day. Now, Elkanah, he couldn't have children. His wife, he was married to Hannah, and you're all probably familiar with this story. Hannah, sadly, couldn't have a child. And I know that, today that's a big deal when people can't have children. And I think even in this time it was even an even bigger deal because you're expected to have children. Now, the scholars suggest that Elkanah, he was just a regular guy. He wasn't of the ruling class. He was probably just middle class. He was faithful to God, though. That much we know. He worshipped the Lord. Why don't we read together? If you've got your Bibles with you, let's turn to 1 Samuel chapter 1. It's going to be on the screen behind me if you don't. So today we're going to be reading this whole chapter, by the way, so be prepared to do lots of reading. Starting at verse 1. There was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zophite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zoph, an Ephraimite. And if you don't agree with my pronunciations, you can talk to me later. He had 2 wives. One was called Hannah, and the other was Peninnah. Do you reckon it's Peninnah? Good. I got a yes from the back row. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phinehas, the two sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. So Peninnah had a lot of kids. But to Hannah, he gave a double portion because he loved her and the Lord had closed her womb. So I think it's fair to say, I think Elkanah, he's a godly man. He was faithful in his worship and he was generous to his family. This is a real patriarchal society. Women were often treated as lesser beings, especially if they couldn't have children. Yet Elkanah, he wasn't like that. He loved Hannah, despite her difficulty in having a child. So we'll keep reading from verse 6. Because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept, and she would not eat. She's starting to get a little bit of a picture, right, of where Hannah's up to here, the desperate state that she was in. You know, it was a deep hurt, and it was bad enough that she couldn't conceive, but Peninnah provoked her and teased her about it. I think it's fair to say she's in a dark place. And the Bible says this actually went on year after year. We're not just talking about a couple of years here. The writer of 1 Samuel is making it real clear that this was something that was going on for a long time. There's a few hints here that I've got of probably how long this may have been. Given that there's a mention that Peninnah had many children and there's a good chance that Hannah was Elkanah's first wife, I think we're probably looking at 10 plus years if you think about this. From what I think has happened is that Hannah and Elkanah have been married, and then when no children have come, as happened in this culture, he went and took a second wife. So if you add up all those years, and if you remember the fact that it says that Peninnah has sons and daughters, a lot of time has passed. In fact, I'd say we're looking at least 10 years. It was so hard for Hannah in this particular year that when she came to Shiloh, it says that she was weeping and she stopped eating. Now, did she stop eating because she was so distraught, or did she stop eating because she was fasting? I'm not 100% sure. It may have been both. Let's go back to the text. So verse 8. Her husband, Elkanah, would say to her, Hannah, this is such a male thing to do, right? Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? Now, Elkanah, I feel like saying, you dummy. What are you doing? My guess is he probably made things a little bit worse for Hannah here. It was, in my opinion, don't you think, a poor response from her husband. You don't need kids, you got me, what's the problem? And, this is sometimes something that we males do at times. When we see our wives, when we see our wives upset, is we want to make it right for them, right then and there, and make, why are you upset? It's okay. You've got me. Everything's okay. Don't be upset. And I think that's what we try to do. But sometimes I think our wives are just looking for a sympathetic ear. They want us just to reassure them, and it's going to be okay. Elkanah was trying. I just don't think he was helping. Verse 9. Once they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. So you can see this is a lot of pain that Hannah's going through here. And in fact, in my older NIV translation that I have, it had a slightly different. It said, in bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much, and she prayed to the Lord. The anguish was deep. She was already hurting from not being able to conceive, and I know some of you here this morning can understand her pain. The pressure on wives in this culture is big, but it was even bigger then, I believe. So much so that we know he probably took a second wife. So you can just get a little bit of a picture of how she was feeling. Then just to make things even worse, her husband's second wife sticks the knife in and twists and twists. In fact, it says in the scripture that she did it every year. And I wonder how many of you have felt pain from circumstances that have left you feeling just a little bit like Hannah does. Just when you think it can't get worse, somebody can stick that knife in and make it worse for you. Years of prayer, and nothing had changed. A deep anguish that overflowed into this emotion that came this time they went to Shiloh. For some, that overflow of anguish, it can be weeping like Hannah. I wonder if some of you are like that, where you can just have this time when you're broken before the Lord and you're weeping. I think it's a common response. And that's what Hannah did too. What Hannah did was something, though, that is often the opposite to what we do in our suffering. What she does is she actually goes to God and she pushes in deeper to him. Hannah remains faithful to God year after year. When her prayer wasn't answered, she remained faithful to him. So my first point for you today is this. When the pain comes, when the difficulty arrives, resist the urge to shut God out. In fact, do the opposite. Draw closer to him, even if it means weeping before God for 10 years, like Hannah did. Why is it for some of us we don't naturally run to God when things go bad? I must admit, I've got a tendency to do that a little bit. I know what that feels like. When things go wrong, my emotions put a wall sometimes between me and the Lord. There's something there that just stops me. There's a blockage. And we often have this question, where is God in my hurt? And for Hannah, her response, though, was to keep pressing in closer to God, even after years of praying without the answer. And then on this particular time that this author recorded in 1 Samuel, this time when she came before the Lord, her response was actually different. This response is amazing. It's in verse 11. And she made a vow saying, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. This is an amazing prayer, actually. Now, I don't want you to get the wrong idea. First reading through, you can think it's like she's trying to make a deal. It's like she's bartering with God. I don't necessarily think that that's what she's doing. Something different had happened this time around. You've got to remember, year in and year out, Hannah was weeping in anguish and praying for a child. But this time her prayer was different. And in my opinion, I think this prayer is exactly the prayer that God wanted her to pray. If I can just jump ahead a little bit here and maybe that'll explain. See, the outcome of this prayer was a baby who would become the priest of Israel. And in fact, he'd become the last judge and set up and be God's instrument for a transition to the first of the monarchy, the first of King Saul and King David. See, God knew what he was doing, and he knew the outcome of Hannah's prayer would be this baby. A baby born in any other circumstances probably wouldn't have been dedicated to the Lord's service like his mother just did. If you think about that, if he answered the prayer the first year she went to Shiloh, I'm not sure she would have prayed that prayer. Did you hear what I'm saying? A baby born in any other circumstances probably wouldn't have been dedicated to the Lord's service. I hope I'm making sense. Years of earnest prayer aligned Hannah's will with God's perfect will. And then she prayed the prayer that he could answer. And then the outcome was wonderful. In fact, the outcome changed history. You know, in 1 John, this is a verse you know well, but maybe now it makes a little bit more sense to you. This is the confidence we have in approaching God, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. And if we know that he hears us, whatever we ask, we know that we have what we ask of him. And if we know that he hears us, whatever we ask, we know that we have what he asked of him. And I think this is one of the reasons why God calls us to be devoted to prayer. It's because through praying, he moves us to know his will and to pray for his will to be done. And his will is perfect. His timing is perfect. I don't just mean a general prayer for God's will to be done, although that's legit. I do that all the time. God, your will be done. And in fact, it's in the Lord's Prayer. And that's a good prayer to pray. I mean, though, that you should pray about everything. And it's when you pray through your needs and your hurts that you start to hear from God and you start to pray the way that he wants you to pray. It's for your benefit as well. This is not just for God. He knows what's best. If there's one thing I want you to take away from today, it's this. Prayer is asking God to align you with his will rather than asking him to be aligned with yours. I'd love to take credit for that particular line. It's not mine, but I agree wholeheartedly with it. I couldn't even find the author, but the sentiment is universal. It's correct. Prayer is asking God to align you with his will rather than asking him to be aligned with ours. This is the way we should come into prayer. God's will and timing is perfect. You may not understand why God hasn't answered your prayer like you want him to, but he always knows best. You can take that to the bank. He is faithful. Let's keep reading though. As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Isn't that great that you can pray in your heart and the Lord hears your prayers? Eli thought she was drunk though, and he said to her, "How long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine." "Not so, my lord." Little L. Hannah replied, "I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief." Eli, to his credit, he turned to her and he said, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." She said, "May your servant find favor in your eyes." Then she went her way and ate something. And you note there, the bold didn't come through on the slide, but in bold I've got, "and her face was no longer downcast." Because I think she knew at this point that her prayer was answered. And I think this is what happens when we pray according to God's will. We have a deep sense that our prayers are going to be answered. You know, recently I read the story, I think it was in Christianity Today, of a pastor who was visiting a very ill man from his church in hospital. And they asked him to come and pray for him to be healed. And he'd done this many times. And many times people hadn't been healed that he'd prayed for. This one particular time, he prayed. And something inside of him said to him, "It's going to happen." And he left the hospital with this knowledge in his mind that this man was going to be healed. And anyway, a couple of days later, the other person's wife rang the pastor and said, "You won't believe what's happened." And he said, "Actually, I do." I already know. I think there's times that we just know that our prayers are going to be answered. And I think that's what happened to Hannah here. You know, it says that she ate something and her face was no longer downcast. I think she knew. God brought a reassurance that day that her prayer was answered. So we go to verse 19 now. Early the next morning, they rose and worshipped before the Lord and then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant, gave birth to a son, and she named him Samuel, saying, "Because I asked the Lord for him." That was his name. When her husband Elkanah went up with all his family to offer the annual sacrifice of the Lord to fulfill his vow, Hannah did not go. She said to her husband, "After the boy is weaned, I will take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always. We'll do what you seems best." Didn't do that right. "Do what seems best to you," her husband Elkanah told her. "Stay here until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord make good his word." So the woman stayed at home and nursed her son until she had weaned him. After he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord in Shiloh. And the bull had been sacrificed. They brought the boy to Eli. She said to him, "Pardon me, my lord. As surely as you live, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child. The Lord has granted me what I asked of him. And so now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he was given over to the Lord." And he worshipped the Lord there. The last thing I want to say to you is follow through on your commitments to God when he answers your prayer. Follow through on them. Can you imagine how hard this was for Hannah? She prayed her whole life for a baby, and then here she is delivering him up to Eli to serve there. I'm sure she saw him often. I've got no doubt about that. But some think that he might have been as young as 3 even. He might have been a little bit older than that. But she did it because she trusted God. This is huge. In fact, I think it's one of the most striking acts of devotion that I've actually seen in the Bible. She returns to God what he graciously gave to her. Having first come to God with nothing, she returns to him to give back that which was everything for her. Isn't that amazing? If God asks you to do something, you do it knowing that you can trust him. And all too often, I think we make a promise or a vow to the Lord, and when it gets difficult, it fades away from our memory. We walk away from it. I know that I've done it. And serious. But I always thank God, he's so full of grace. He's so full of mercy. He takes me back every time. It's God's desire that you come to him in your time of pain, church, when you go through suffering, and everyone has been through that or is going through it. Hannah remained faithful to God because she knew how faithful he is and that he never gives up on us. So Hannah found peace through pouring out her soul to our faithful God. And here's what I like about the story. God continually works out his purposes through everyday, ordinary folk like me and like you sitting here. He's looking for people like Hannah. In other words, regular people like us. But he wants us to go deeper in our love for him in our times of pain. I think these are the people that God knows he can trust with his purposes. Hannah waits and worships, and the answer is an amazing gift. And look, I could leave it here. I think that that's a great message for us. But I know that for many of you, you've prayed faithfully like Hannah, and maybe that answer didn't come. In fact, it can't come in a way. Perhaps someone's passed away. We know that God hasn't abandoned us. He knows your pain. You've got to remember, our God, he's different to all the other world religions. Firstly, he's the only real one, I know that, but he's the God that understands pain and suffering. He's the one that actually chose to go through that. So he understands. It's in those times we hold on to what God has already done for us and what he's promised to do. And I'm so grateful for Paul when he's prayed 3 times, Lord, remove this thorn from my flesh. And God didn't. And we don't know what the thorn is. It could be a health issue. It could be that he was a nervous speaker. I've picked up on some of that from my reading of Paul. He was better with the letters than with the public speaking, apparently. That's what he said. It could be a person or a persecution or something like that. Lord, remove it. And then he said, but I know your grace is sufficient. I know your grace is sufficient. I'm not just saying it, it's truth. God's grace is sufficient even for our loss and pain. So sometimes it's bigger than we think it is. Our hope is not in our present circumstances. It's in the wonderful eternity in heaven with Jesus. And guaranteed then, whatever you've prayed, if it's for a healing or if it's whatever it is, that prayer is answered. Some people have to wait till then, but their prayer is answered. So Esther, if you in the band want to join me back here, I got a story for you. It might be familiar to many of you. Horatio Spafford. Does that name sound familiar? He was a wealthy Chicago lawyer with a thriving legal practice. He had a beautiful home. He had a wife, 4 daughters, and a son. He was a devout Christian. He was a faithful student of the Bible. And in fact, his friends was D.L. Moody and Ira Sankey. These are well-known Christians in history. At the very height of his financial and professional success, this is a true story, Horatio and his wife Anna suffered the tragic loss of their young son. And then, shortly after, on October the 8th, 1871, the Great Chicago Fire destroyed all of their real estate. 2 years later, Spafford scheduled a boat trip to Europe in order to give his wife and daughters and himself a much-needed rest. And he sent them ahead because he had some loose ends to tie up. While he was still in Chicago, he got a message. And the message said, your family's ship has gone down. All your daughters have been lost, and only your wife survived. And Spafford, he boarded a boat that would take him to England where his wife was. And as he was travelling over, he penned a very famous hymn. When sorrow like sea billows roll, it is well. It is well with my soul. And I know for many of you, you've prayed like Hannah has. But God's grace is sufficient. And your soul, it's okay. It is well because of the hope that you have.